Europe at the beginning of the 20th century was a seething mass of tensions. Advances in technologies brought about unimaginable destruction. Old regimes were clinging on to power, and new ones were eager to establish themselves. Many of the citizens of Europe were forced to decide which moral compass they wished to adopt. Families became fractured, and none embodied this split more than the Mitford sisters.
I think the fact that there were 6 of them and that they were mainly homeschooled meant that they could spark off each other in a way that was in some ways very productive and in other ways quite damaging.
Until really very late in her life, Diana thought of Winston Churchill as a dreadful war criminal who was worse than Hitler.
In grammar school, when the subject of communism came up and the horrors of it, I would raise my hand and try to give the other side of the story, and it didn't work out so well.
Jessica the communist and Diana the fascist were separated by only a few years in age, but were poles apart in ideology.
For Jessica, who'd romanticised Diana so much, there was a wide gap between the Diana who Jessica had looked up to and the Diana who now existed.
They had a zest for publicity at any cost. Diana would have been perfectly capable, if she'd been a normal, sensible person, of living quietly in Paris and not always picking quarrels with Jessica in public. And she, likewise, wanted to go on attacking her sister as an old Nazi, so that they both enjoyed the publicity.
That was what they were like. The rivalries and the interplay of it was just almost infinite.
It started out as this rivalry. I'm a red, you're a Nazi, but it wasn't serious, and when it became serious, it became horrible.
Like so many others of their era, their personal and political lives became so entwined that they ultimately shattered the once strong and loving bonds of sisterhood. The Mitford sisters were perhaps the most famous siblings of 20th century Britain. Nancy, Pamela and Diana, Unity, Jessica and Deborah. Born between 1904 and 1920, the 6 aristocratic women were witty, eccentric, beautiful and ever controversial. But they were far from a pack of duplicates. Fiercely competitive, each sister sought out her own distinct identity and clashed with the other siblings as a result.
They were born into this rather remote house in the Oxfordshire countryside, and in a way I think that's the clue to the whole story, because they didn't, properly speaking, have any friends. They had one another, and life was a nursery game, even for the older ones, but certainly for the younger ones.
All of them were born either before, during, or after the First World War. So they were born into a world that was just about to change massively.
Those 6 very competitive, rivalrous, bright sisters, all sort of flashing off each other. Semi-feral and in another way very protected, because they'd never crossed the road alone, you know, until they were 16 or something, or probably not even then. It was an odd, unrepeatable mixture.
They had no proper friends and no entertainment. So all family entertainments in these English country houses were in the family, and you showed off like mad, and you did charades and you did silly acts and tricks. They carried that on into public life.
The family did not possess vast wealth. The Mitfords' father, Lord Redesdale, was an energetic and theatrical personality, but had little financial sense. His money troubles repeatedly forced the family to sell off land and other property. They eventually settled in the village of Swinbrook, Oxfordshire, in a house Redesdale built himself. There, a new dynamic developed among the later Mitford children, Jessica, Unity and Deborah. They made up their own languages, formed secret societies, and played silly pranks. But for Jessica, the glamorous Diana was always her idol.
I don't think it's possible to think she looked at Diana other than with huge admiration to start with.
I think Diana had a huge effect upon everybody, pretty much, who ever met her, which includes me. I met her not long before she died, and I've thought about her probably every week since. She could have charmed Karl Marx, I think, even though her politics were somewhat to the right of his. And she was very warm and very funny.
Jessica slightly hero worshipped her, I think, partly because she was the most beautiful, and partly because she was infinitely the cleverest, and she was very widely read in European literature and so forth.
Jessica said she was like the perfect older sister. She had this marvellous sort of moon goddess look, this incredible dynamic serenity about her. She had every gift a woman could have.
I think any young girl in that situation would look up to her older sister. It'd be difficult not to. I mean, her older sister was living this life of glamour, of freedom. It seemed very perfect and very romantic to her.
Both Diana and Jessica were fiercely intelligent, but neither girl attended school. Instead, they were given free rein of the family's extensive library, and a governess was employed to educate them at home.
They were educated in quite a piecemeal manner. Sometimes they had governesses, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they were just allowed to roam free.
They weren't taught properly. It was considered common to send girls to school, and anyway, they were very wild.
They were incredibly intelligent girls, so being homeschooled influenced them according to their personalities, really, one might say. It wasn't quite as defining an element as I think we, with our possibly more conventional view of schooling, sort of now view it.
This informal education was an early battleground for Jessica. She wanted to go to school like other children, but it was forbidden by her stern mother. This desire to go against family tradition was a pointer to greater rebellions to come. And she was not the only sister chafing against parental expectations. By 1928, Diana was 18 and bored. She longed to leave the drudgery of life at home. Already a renowned society beauty, she knew the power she could wield over men. This would be her escape route. Brian Guinness met Diana at a summer ball in 1928. He was far from the first to fall in love with her, but Guinness was tall, handsome, intelligent, and, as heir to the brewery giant that bore his family name, enormously wealthy.
She was 18, and she married him, and he adored her, and all his friends adored her.
She fell in love, I think, with Brian Guinness because he was a bit like the hero of one of Tolstoy's novels. He saw himself as being like Levine in Anna Karenina, the sort of gentleman farmer who lived in the country, wrote poems, mixed with literary people. Their best friends were Lytton Strachey and the Bloomsbury set.
She believed that she was in love with him after she met him, but she married him very young. She'd not really seen much of the world.
Despite the initial resistance of Diana's parents, who thought her too young, the couple's engagement was soon announced. They were married in St Margaret's, Westminster on the 29th of January 1929. The couple soon became a fixture of the London social scene, and the bright young things of the day flocked to the newlyweds' elegant home near Buckingham Palace. Jessica marvelled at her older sister's life. Diana had the looks, the wealth, and soon the happy young children too. But it was, if anything, too perfect.
She very quickly found him boring. His diaries are unintentionally comic masterpieces, because he would say, had dinner, Lytton Strachey, Winston Churchill dropped in for drinks afterwards. We also met Jean-Paul Sartre, and he would just put a bit boring at the end. So he had no interest at all in this stream of supposedly amusing people who were coming to see them.
She had this very austere brain, and I think, although it was very nice being written about in Tatler, you know, oh, Mrs. Guinness, it's wearing trousers, let's all wear trousers like Mrs. Guinness, you know, all that nonsense. I think she was kind of bored, actually.
When she married him, she came into this glittering world of London, of parties, of Evelyn Noir, of this kind of vile bodies, bright young thing world. And she realised that the world was much bigger than she had previously believed it to be.
She had this marvellous dog, this fantastic wolfhound, and she used to feed him raw meat from her hands. And that almost felt like a symbol of what was really something more earthy that she wanted. And then, of course, she met Mosley.
It was at a lunch in February 1932 that Diana met Sir Oswald Mosley. Mosley had once been the youngest MP in the House of Commons, but by 1932 he had abandoned first the Conservatives and then the Labour Party to strike out as leader of his own political organisation. Inspired by the Italian dictator Mussolini, Mosley christened his new party the British Union of Fascists. Diana was soon intoxicated by him. Her future, that of her sister Jessica, and the whole Mitford family would be changed forever. Born into privilege, Diana and Jessica Mitford had grown up in the aristocratic world of the 1920s. To the young Jessica, it must have seemed that Diana had struck gold when she married Brian Guinness in 1929. But this gilded life bored Diana, and in 1932 she began an affair with Oswald Mosley.
Oswald Mosley had been the rising hope of the Labour Party. He was Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster in Ramsay MacDonald's cabinet, and he'd been a war hero, and he really believed in socialism as the answer for the dreadful poverty and social problems which faced Britain after the First World War. Obviously, he was a sort of power maniac as well, and one could say a very unpleasant individual. But I think his political ideas were perfectly genuine and idealistic.
I think the thing about Mosley was he was sexy, not to us, but she definitely thought he was. He got through society women like nobody's business.
He was a fantastic womanizer, and she was very beautiful, and she was extremely bored by her marriage.
Diana, still only 22, was entranced by Mosley from their first meeting. He was handsome and charismatic, with a forceful personality, quite different to Diana's gentle, poetic husband, Brian. Within months, she would ask for a divorce. At the beginning of 1933, she left the luxurious family home she had built with the Guinness heir and moved into a run-down flat near Mosley in Belgravia.
She said to me, I became very poor. This meant a slightly smaller house in Belgravia. But she did relatively. She gave up everything. She gave up a lovely husband, really lovely man, and she gave up her social position. She gave up an idyll, really.
Diana used to say that if you've been married to a Guinness and then you stop being married to a Guinness, you always feel poor, however rich you are compared with the rest of the world.
She said that she knew that the only way that it would end between them would be with one of them dying.
She was literally swept off her feet by Oswald Mosley, and they had this passionate affair which caused great scandal and grief to everybody around them. She was determined to marry him. He was the one man in her life, as it were.
She used to go to these terrible rallies, the infamous one at Olympia in 1934. She would just sit there. They'd have had a dinner party before, probably eaten, asparagus and soufflés and things, and then she'd go and sit among these maniacs, hurling chairs and knuckle dusters and stuff. She must have, in some unfathomable way, liked it.
If you look at people like the upper class and the upper middle class in Britain at the time, their natural sympathy, so horrified were they by communism, was to side with the fascists, if necessary. There was an enormous unemployment. And when you saw the rise of Hitler, who appeared to have eliminated unemployment in 18 months, it was very hard not to think, here was a man who was capable of bringing to pass what Keynes had written about in his economic textbooks.
The affair with Mosley did more than just stun the rest of the Mitford family. It also created a model for Diana's sisters to follow. Jessica too was attracted to strong personalities, and she would soon make her own escape from the stifling world of the aristocracy. Unlike Diana, however, it was left-wing politics that Jessica embraced.
As a young girl, her thinking about the state of the nation was incredibly similar to Diana's. She was exercised by the terrible unemployment. She thought Britain was going to hell and nobody cared. All the same things that Diana had said, but it took her in the other direction.
The whole development of what was going on in Spain, what was going on in Germany, what was going on in Italy, you couldn't sit back and be indifferent to it if you were a person of any sensitivity or intelligence.
The 20th century was defined by these polarizing forces of communism on the one side, fascism on the other, and the sisters were to become very subject to these forces.
I think there are certain moments in political life. The English Civil War is one such, where one side of the family might be supporting Oliver Cromwell and the other the king. I think it's quite often the case that families divide in this way, and that people who are engaged intellectually in their own times are bound to feel strongly.
She was completely sincere, but at the same time there is this element of posturing, because whatever they did, they were still who they were. And even when they got themselves into these terrible situations, they were still who they were, and they still had this absolute confidence of the upper class.
Jessica's childhood idolization of Diana gave way to bitter opposition. She became an angry, rebellious teenager, defining herself against the extreme associations of not only Diana, but also her sister Unity. Jessica and Unity had been mischievous co-conspirators in childhood, as close as sisters can be. But in the 1930s, as Jessica explored socialist politics, Unity became obsessed with the Nazis. Their shared room at home was soon decked half in swastikas and half in communist banners.
It started out as this rivalry. You know, I'm a red, you're a Nazi, but it wasn't serious. And when it became serious, it became horrible for my mother.
Unity got in very deeply. She got in far too deep.
Unity was out there, she had her flat, she was learning German. She kept going to a restaurant where Hitler had his lunch, and she just sat there waiting for him to call her over to the table. And she's like this breathless teenage crush. The way she describes it, it's the Mitford idiom that makes it so sinister. All this blissful furor. Oh, the Führer was in a rage today. Oh, it's so exciting. I mean, this is for real.
With her extraordinary Mitford confidence, Unity charmed the dictator. She was invited to join him and other top Nazis at social occasions. Diana was soon accompanying her. The pair attended Nuremberg rallies and watched the Berlin Olympic Games in 1936 as honoured guests.
Unity was still going back to Munich at the end of the 30s, going to watch the Wagner at Bayreuth. She was in Austria when it was annexed. It wasn't a sexual relationship with Hitler, but she was his close companion, no question. He liked her. And Diana was there too.
They became quite close friends with him. They were quite deeply ingrained with the inner Nazi party.
Diana, who was a sophisticate, she liked mingling with the Nazi high command. She liked mingling with powerful men, like some women do. She wasn't repelled by their politics.
Diana's visits were not just social calls. The British Union of Fascists were in severe financial difficulty, so Diana used her connections with senior Nazis to secure vital support. It is perhaps no surprise then that Germany was where Diana and Mosley finally married. The ceremony took place on the 6th of October 1936 at the house of Joseph Goebbels. In attendance was Adolf Hitler, whose wedding present was a signed photograph of himself. While Diana was celebrating her wedding alongside the most powerful men in Europe, her younger sister Jessica was also finding romance. The object of her affection was a young man named Esmond Romilly. Romilly was Jessica's second cousin. He had been a public school revolutionary whose beliefs had taken him from boyhood rebellion to the battlefields of Spain.
The Spanish War was coming along. It was clear which side she was going to be on. She would be anti-Franco, long before Romilly came on the scene.
He fought on the side of the revolutionaries in the Spanish Civil War. They were quite idealistic.
He kind of put his money where his mouth was in that sense, and he wrote a book about it. This was all before he was 20. And so obviously, to Jessica, he was an incredibly romantic figure. She was fired up by the cause that he embodied, and the two together was dynamite.
On their first meeting, they were immediately captivated by one another. Jessica asked him to take her back with him to Spain. He agreed. They quickly hatched a plan to run away. In the spring of 1937, the Mitford family was in crisis. They were already a fixture in the tabloid press thanks to the exploits of Diana and the Hitler-obsessed Unity. Now the newspapers had a fresh scandal. The second youngest Mitford sister, Jessica, had vanished from London in the company of Esmond Romilly, a charismatic young revolutionary who shared her left-wing ideals. For 2 weeks, neither friends nor family had any clue where she was, or even if she was alive.
It was scandalous to a degree, but by that point, I mean, the Mitfords had had quite a lot of scandal. It's kind of almost what was expected. And Jessica had been saving up a kitty to run away since she was 12 years old. It was treated as rather a joke by the family, but she was very determined that she was going to run away, and she did.
She was very bored by being a debutante. One has a certain sympathy, but what she did was also cruel. She pretended to her parents that she was going on a holiday with some friends. They were terribly excited. They thought it would cheer her up. They took her to Victoria Station. They gave her £10 spending money and waved her away, and her father never saw her again. And in his later life, Unity said to him, "Who would you most like to walk in through the door?" And he said, "Decker." He never really got over that.
By the time the Mitfords discovered the truth, the young couple were far from England. They made their way to Bilbao. There, Romilly began work as a journalist reporting on the civil war still raging in Spain between government forces and those of the fascist General Franco.
Lots of people tried to bring them back. They said to the UK ambassador to Spain, "You have to find Jessica Mitford and bring them back." And he sent a message back saying, "Found Jessica Mitford, bringing her back is impossible."
Churchill was involved, everyone was involved. This is the thing, they were still who they were. You know, everyone was worried about if they'd just been two of the kind of people they purported to want to be, i.e. ignored working classes, they would never have had the attention and the care that they had.
Finally, the efforts of the British consul in Bilbao did convince them to leave, but Jessica and Romilly refused to go any further than southern France. By now, Jessica was pregnant, and the priority for the Mitfords changed. She had to marry before the baby was born. So it was, on the 18th of May 1937, that Jessica and Romilly wed in Bayonne in the south of France. They finally felt able to come back to England, but they did not return to the comfortable lives they had enjoyed before. Instead, they settled in Rotherhithe, a working-class area of London. There, a few months later, Jessica gave birth to a daughter. In 1938, a measles epidemic swept through that part of London. Jessica had never contracted the illness. Her sheltered upbringing had protected her from it. Tragically, this meant she could not pass on immunity to her baby daughter. The little girl died, aged just 5 months.
Just her grief is very private, and she doesn't want to have a display of it. Her outlook is very healthy, in my opinion.
The funeral, none of the family were allowed to go. They were kind of living according to principles, because if they'd been working class, their baby could have died just the same and nobody would have helped them. But what were they achieving? What were they proving? It is very like when Diana went to live in Eaton Square and waited for Mosley to come round and deign to see her. They took up these positions with these men and they carried them through no matter what. What they really thought, no one would ever know, because they weren't those kinds of women. But she paid a terrible price, Jessica.
In their grief, Jessica and Romilly fled England once again. This time they headed for America. The Europe Jessica left behind was heading for war. This was Diana's nightmare. As late as July 1939, she was in Germany assuring Hitler that she and Mosley would continue to campaign for peace as long as that was possible. The prospect of war was even more alarming to Diana's Hitler-obsessed sister Unity. She could not bear the idea of conflict between the two countries she loved. So, after Germany's invasion of Poland made war with Britain inevitable, she went to the park in the centre of Munich and shot herself in the head.
She didn't manage to kill herself. The bullet lodged in her brain and they couldn't remove it. And her parents went through this whole thing again of not knowing where she was, not knowing what had happened. Eventually she was transported back to England, a very diminished person.
And that was a tragedy for my mother. They were just such tight friends. And then when Unity became a fascist, it's like my best friend just became a fascist. How horrible, but I still love her.
She was very mentally fragile. She shot herself. There were many things that showed her mental fragility.
In January 1940, the recovering Unity was finally sent back to England via neutral Switzerland. She had little understanding of what had happened to her, or why the British people now hated her so. The bullet lodged in her brain had reduced Unity to a state of permanent childhood. But she was not the only Mitford sister despised by the public. Diana, wife to the leader of the British Union of Fascists, was viewed with open suspicion. Many feared a German invasion would see her husband installed as Britain's puppet ruler.
He was adamantly patriotic and said, I don't want this war, but I will always fight for my country. Nevertheless, under wartime regulations, he was arrested and sent to jail. And in June of 1940, Diana was also arrested.
They were never charged with anything because they were remand prisoners under this regulation called 18B, which suspended habeas corpus for the duration of the war. And so they could wear their own clothes, but they were both taken off to prisons in London. And they were separate for 3 years, and in the last year, they were together at Holloway Prison.
She was kept in until November 1943. No trial, so therefore no knowledge of how long she would be in there for. I mean, this was wartime internment. Nevertheless, she was kept in far, far longer than any other fascist women who had children. She was made an example of. Absolutely no question.
That created this tremendous bond, that here were these two people who'd been, as she considered, unjustly imprisoned. And so that it was the Mosley's contra mundum after that.
Conditions in prison were terrible for Diana, but the experience bonded her even more tightly to her husband. Reviled by the rest of the world, perhaps for the first time, Diana had the womanizing Sir Oswald entirely to herself. In America, Jessica fully supported her sister's incarceration. Her one-time adoration of Diana had by now transformed into an equally strong hatred.
I think there was a wide gap between the Diana who Jessica had looked up to and the Diana who now existed.
Really, it was Unity who should have taken the brunt of Jessica's fullest rage, but in some ways she blamed Diana for sort of sending Unity down that path in the first place. Diana was in Holloway, but she was still Diana, she was still gorgeous, she was still compelling. So she took the full force of Jessica's rage, and Jessica sort of seemed to blame her kind of single-handedly for the war, which was insane, but maybe understandable.
Unity was very vulnerable, and I think the family believed that she needed to be looked after. Perhaps her illness diminished her responsibility to an extent where Diana was totally compos mentis and went along with it anyway.
Jessica's only contact with her family was now through letters. She would soon become even more isolated. In 1940, her husband Romilly joined the Canadian Air Force and volunteered to fight in Europe. He went missing in action on the 30th of November 1941. He was 23. Romilly's death only sharpened Jessica's loathing of Diana, the older sister who represented everything her young husband had died fighting. Diana Mitford and her husband Sir Oswald Mosley were released from Holloway Prison in November 1943. Their incarceration without trial or charge had divided the country. Many were firmly opposed to their release. Among the angry protesters were Diana's sisters, Jessica and Nancy.
They definitely believed that they should have kept Diana in prison. Later evidence of things Diana said in support of fascism definitely bear that out.
Nancy went back to the Home Office and said, I'm not sure about this, I'm not sure you should be letting them out.
The British ambassador in Paris, Gladwin Jebb, told Diana, do you realise the reason you got sent to prison during the war was that Nancy had shocked you? She'd been to Churchill and said, I think Diana is a national security risk and you should lock her up. And Diana was absolutely appalled, but she kept it a secret.
Nancy had the face to say, oh, Jessica, you really shouldn't have done that, darling. Nancy was, she was a snake. But Jessica was open about it, full on about it. And what she then did, she wrote an open letter to Churchill saying this is a slap in the face for anti-fascists, and I'm appalled. She simply was iron about this.
By this stage, the sisters had not spoken in years. The end of the war in 1945 brought no reconciliation, and even their common grief at the death of their beloved sister Unity in May 1948 did not heal the rift. Jessica remained in America. There she forged a new life with left-wing activist and lawyer Robert Truhaft.
He, after the war, became a human rights lawyer. He was Jewish, which she probably quite liked that fact, given her family history. And he had to write to his mother saying, don't worry, she's not like her sisters.
Well, he laughed at the whole Mitford thing. He loved it, he just thought it was funny.
It was a glorious time to be alive in the United States, because the civil rights movement was getting going and she threw herself completely behind that. The good old cause, as she called it, the sort of left-wing cause, continued to occupy her, whether she was campaigning for civil rights for black people or whether she was anti the Vietnam War. There was plenty to campaign about and march about.
That was everything. There was them going off to meetings. That was them, living in integrated neighborhoods. That was my father with his Harvard law degree, making so little money that he wrote in a letter of apology to the alumni saying he's really sorry that he's brought the average down quite a bit because everybody else was making, $100,000 a year and he was making 10 or 20,000, defending black defendants, because this is what the Communist Party was doing, fighting against police brutality against blacks and against police brutality against communists.
Her politics mellowed to being a Democrat, really. But she took up the causes of her husband. She became active in civil rights, and then she became a campaigning journalist and writer.
Her left-wing politics drew unwanted attention. It was the era of McCarthyism in America, Public paranoia about Reds was growing. In this climate, Jessica's unrestrained communism led the FBI to put her under surveillance.
There was a file on her. She was a serious sort of potential enemy of the state, rather, oddly, as Mosley was in Britain when he and Diana were released. But he was viewed with the same sort of suspicion, rightfully so. It was almost a similar situation to Jessica's in America.
It was assumed we were bugged by the FBI, but it was also assumed that it was kind of stupid and funny. We weren't terrorized by it like many other people were, you know.
Diana and her husband were still pariahs on account of their fascist beliefs. Unable to stand it any longer, the couple moved to France. Diana and Jessica would meet only once again in their lives in 1973, when the siblings gathered to say goodbye to their older sister, the novelist Nancy Mitford.
She had a cancer. They didn't diagnose it for years, Hodgkin's lymphoma. She went through absolute hell.
Horribly painful, endless operations, and it was all pretty gruesome, and it went on for months.
Jessica did come over from America to see her, and that was when she saw Diana.
Jessica and Diana were completely at one. They weren't just being polite, they felt absolute harmony together. I sometimes think it's a bit like the football match in the trenches between the British and the Germans, getting on perfectly well, and then on Boxing Day, they went back to bombarding one another. And similarly, as soon as Jessica went back to the United States, she continued to hurl insults across the Atlantic to Diana. And Diana was constantly accusing Jessica of being spiteful or of lying. Spiteful was just a word for non-fascist in Diana's vocabulary.
All the sisters were great letter writers, exchanging hundreds with each other throughout their lives. Nancy was always the author of the family, and her early novels, The Pursuit of Love and Love in a Cold Climate, were thinly veiled autobiographies. But in 1960, Jessica went one step further and published her own memoirs, Hons and Rebels.
It's a very good book, and she was a very good writer. But it's a little bit naughty in a way, because she did have her cake and eat it. The family hated the book.
Everybody knows how unreliable all the Mitfords' accounts are of the childhood when Hons and Rebels came out. The other sisters all said, oh, well, you've made it all up, darling.
All the stuff that Nancy had put in The Pursuit of Love, she kind of used all that and got the mileage out of it, and then said, oh, but aren't they all frightful? I'm not like that. I'm absolutely lovely because I'm left-wing and I don't have really much to do with these awful people. But nevertheless, I'm going to tell you about them because they're quite good copy.
Nancy wrote, but because she fictionalised them, it was seen as okay. But once Jessica wrote something, and she actually wrote it about the family, using their real names, then this was seen as a huge betrayal.
Diana was incandescent. She wrote a letter to the TLS saying, you'd think we were all morons from this book. Actually, we had access to this wonderful library, which they did, because both her grandfathers were MPs, they were cultured men. They didn't grow up quite like the raging ruffians that Jessica would have had one believe.
3 years after Hons and Rebels, Jessica achieved still greater success with The American Way of Death, an exposé of the shady and exploitative practices of the funeral business in the United States. Diana was also a gifted writer. She became a columnist, writing for Tatler magazine and the Evening Standard newspaper for many years. Throughout, she remained devoted to her husband, Sir Oswald Mosley, until he died in 1980. She never renounced her politics or regretted her friendship with Hitler.
I am sympathetic to the idea that one can fall for a big idea and then not realise how deep one has got in, and I think that's what happened to her. She was a perfectly decent human being, unquestionably the most tragic person I've ever known, because she realised she'd embraced a whole lot of ideas which were repellent, which were awful. She wasn't a fool, but I think she found it hard to confront her earlier self.
From my point of view, that's not forgivable. I mean, if she'd held her hands up later in life, at any stage in her life, and said, I am so sorry, I believe that, I'm so sorry I followed him, then that would have been forgivable.
What I think was always interesting with her, because of this sort of double-edged approach to life, on the one hand, the reasonable, kind, sweet, clever Diana realised that it was deplorable what she'd done as a young woman. On the other, she'd never quite admit it. In old age, she used to say, what we were all struggling for and fighting for was what we've now achieved, which is a united, peaceful Europe with Germany at the top.
Jessica, too, never abandoned her faith in communism. She continued to live in America until she died from lung cancer in 1996, a wealthy woman after her writing success. She was 78. The once adored but later reviled Diana outlived Jessica by 7 years. She died in 2003, shortly after her 93rd birthday. Throughout their lives and since, they have been the subjects of tabloid speculation, of thinly veiled fictions, and of countless biographies. Yet the allure of these Mitford sisters endures.
People at my school knew about it, and so Mitford became sort of a thing suddenly, but I kind of ignored it. I don't know what's in this weird British mind that causes them to be so fascinated by my aunts.
It's a really complicated legacy, isn't it? It's very light and dark. There's froth, and then there's this darkness, there's this tragedy. They're this beautiful family, and it is sort of like a Nancy Mitford novel. You know, you have this kind of very comic setting, these very relatable, lovely comic people, and then suddenly they do something massively inappropriate.
We like reading about people who are so-called larger than life, and the Mitfords, I'm afraid, all of them are like that. They long to be in the papers. And if it meant having a reputation for being a Nazi, so much the worse or better, but they didn't care.
We're completely hung up about class in this country. If it's served up to us in the right way, what we profess to want to destroy will still entice us. It leaves aside the huge moral questions that they bring up. They're so familiar to us that we almost make them less interesting than they should be.
People like my mom because she's a red, and she never did change. And people hate Diana for the same reason.
They were extraordinary women living in extraordinary times, but their appeal rests not on their achievements alone, nor on the monumental events they witnessed. For the lives of Diana and Jessica were shaped most by experiences more familiar to us all, the trials and joys of family, of love, of grief, and of sisterhood.